Hi again. Part of, in some senses, a deeper beginning conversation about the changing role of reform in education, public education in the country, is to try and be very explicit around what are the elements that are at play. And to do so, I always struggle for some ways deeper and back into what I think is in some senses not made explicit and confuses us and ties us and tangles us up a little bit into the journey. And so this is an attempt at least to get us all thinking about the issue of education in our lives and in a society, what we really think is going on there and what we want to have happen there, and then the level of dialogue that it kind of emerges, if you will, in the public sector in ongoing kind of talk. Not just talk in the newspaper, but talk in schools and talk in lunch rooms with teachers, meetings, and so forth. Because in some senses, the first argument I'm going to make is that we usually start the discussion somehow way deep into the puzzle, and we never stop and think about what it is we are really playing with when we play with all of the discussions of how. So one way to think about this is in just layers of a discussion about anything, all right? The Jesuits, of which I come out of that tradition, always, interestingly enough, in their 4 years of theology, at a Jesuit university, we always started with a first course in theology, and we basically almost always phrased it as the problem of God. And the reason we started there is that you really want the learner to think about the issue historically and in her own life in such a way that this is a real question. It is not somehow beginning to read texts of some other world and some other thinker. You want to start and say, this is going to be forever a question in your life. So let's start with the real question. Well, the real question out here is never a question of how. The question is always back here in a question of what and ultimately a question of why. And by that I simply mean, if you start the dialogue around what you want to teach and what you think is good teaching, and in some senses how you're going to measure it, in some senses you beg the questions back here of what you actually think you're doing in that 12-year, 16, 18-year journey. What is it you're actually trying to do, and why in the world are you doing it? Right? And if you start in the Western world with the early texts of how we start to read about this, the deadly courses that a lot of you went through called Philosophy 101 about philosophy of education, you start in some senses with some telltale stuff. You start with Aristotle and Plato. And early on, that literature, in some senses, begins by basically, if you think about it early on, and I hope you had this dialogue when you were 18 or 19, all right, is that they start with talking about sorting out men of gold, men of silver, and men of some base metal. In some senses, some sort of deep early sorting of the society into different levels of participation based on some sort of their criteria around merit, all right, skill, around humanity or cognitive growth, or where you were born. But the issue is, at least it starts back in here with at least the right question, what it was you were trying to do. If you look at many of the modern competitive first class economic units in the world, all right, most of Europe and some of, certainly some of North America and so forth, there are many different variations at the national level around what it is this thing called a public education is. In many ways, in Germany and France or Great Britain, you know, where certainly our tradition began with German university models and so forth, there's a good deal of language around sorting and meritocracy, all right? Sorting children into skills. As early as possible, a group that in some senses in our language would be blue collar, and a group that would be white collar, and so forth. It's clear also that we were born in a different moment over against, in some senses, much of that philosophy of birth and meritocracy. We were born with a good deal of a dream and a lot of rhetoric around equality here. Equality of human beings, equality of beginning, no matter what one's birth was, and so forth, and certainly equality of access and opportunity. And somewhere early on, a fellow by the name of Dewey gets a lot of credit for it, and I think appropriately, we basically decide that this thing called public education is one of the major vehicles to deliver this kind of equal citizenship. All right, and it's gone through phase after phase of this. There were clearly moments, economically as well, in which all we wanted was literacy and a certain respect for authority. If the public education system delivered that, we had ready workers in a factory and the machinery would move, the machinery of the society. All right? And we've been through many, many other phases of this. But the point really, I think, is that I think this is not very explicit, particularly when the reform starts. It usually starts, look at where it started recently. It starts out here a bit in left field, and it starts with a question of why don't we evaluate teachers? All right? It starts with that question and some competitive data across the then industrial world that says we aren't doing very well. Our children are not scoring very well in the sciences and mathematics. Those are the two questions it begins with about 10 years ago. All right? And when those two things combine, it starts kind of an element of reform out here that says we will measure, we will sort, we will basically find out how we're doing, but by golly, we're also going to make sure that this group of rascals who have not been evaluated ever in their lives are going to be evaluated. So we start with a fundamental down the stream set of questions. That, if you ask that question, you have to ask the next question almost immediately with almost no research, which is to say, well, if I'm going to evaluate them, I better figure out what it looks like. And at that moment, we take off the shelf, for all intents and purposes, 2 or 3 people who've been writing maybe 10, 15 years, and we grab 2.5 models of rubrics that define how a teacher teaches well. At least that's the argument. And it happens really overnight. We don't take time to think about that or debate it much. We look at it, says this is pretty good, this is not bad, and let's try this one. And in some senses, almost within a year to 2 years, the debate around the evaluation is already adopted one or other of those rubrics, if you will, on how to teach. If you basically go there, then you have to figure out somehow how to train people to do that, all right? But meanwhile, there's a second cascading piece of reform that says part of this ought not to be simply the process of looking at them and watching them do this thing, but watching them perform the surgery, but it would help if we measured how many people lived and died, all right? And by that, I don't mean it sarcastically. I mean, you can look at 3 things when you evaluate this kind of a profession. You can look at input, all right? You can look at input, and that's all we used to look at. A degree, some time and hours spent, and some seniority. And that didn't give us much, and we didn't use it because there's not much there to use, all right? You can move to a pure output model, all right? Or you can move to some sort of a process model, or you can move to some sort of a combination. I don't think we were very explicit about what it was we were walking away from and what we were walking to, but we certainly walked to process and grabbed a couple of models, and then right behind it came a very powerful set of a kind of accusatory, but also driven by some folks who do simpler work than teaching, all right? That simply said, well, what's their output? Their output is a learner. And so here you go around this curve. Are you telling me I can't evaluate just on process? I have to evaluate the learner? How in the world do I evaluate the learner? Must be something about growth, all right? Cognitive growth? Sure, cognitive growth. Give me something of that, all right? And we have almost no literature around the cognitive growth piece. We have some, all right? We have also some literature around moral growth and development, social growth, all right? But we move very, very quickly. Within 2 to 3 years, and we simply say, and there are pieces of legislation that drive this, you must now connect what you know about the learner's growth, all right, in some sort of output fashion and marry it up with process, and you will have a valid evaluation. Train everybody and do it. And try to do that within 2 to 3 years. Some states actually have a Department of Education with some staff and some skills, and they really try very hard to do this. Most of the states do not have those resources or those skills, and so they grab what they can from the streetcar going by, all right? And don't forget that is being debated in a somewhat unsophisticated environment sometimes frankly, in state legislatures, in subcommittees, all right? And then given to a rather large House or Senate to vote on very quickly, all right? And what you have is within 4 to 5 years across the country, you have a good deal of patching together of very questionable questions around the how. And my point is that as you do that, you get driven, whether you like it or not, back into some fundamental questions eventually, because let me pose the last question here, of course, that I almost slipped by, which is, meanwhile, right in the middle of this transition, but after it, after evaluation, after some dialogue around how to measure the learner, an enormously powerful piece of reform legislation that says we want to change for the sake of our children and competitiveness. We want to go upstream with respect to what it is we teach. And we don't call it exactly curriculum, we call it standards, but there's explicit kind of cell here that says, don't you want higher standards for your children? Of course I do, all right? And don't you want world competitive standards for your children? Of course I do, all right? Well, that's what this is, and here's the curriculum that hopefully delivers it, or here's a bunch of them, or they're fast being formed and written across the country, all right, by 3 or 4 external agents that have a good deal to earn if they can sell it. And this thing, in some senses, comes in the middle of this. So there is, right behind this, somebody does start to slip into what I would call the area of what it is you teach. But I want to go more deeply here for just a minute, all right? If you, in some senses, stop there, and you say for a moment, what got framed in the last 10 years and what it is to teach? If you look at that little simple red circle as I come around it, what happens in behind it is that there is an emerging definition of the profession itself and what it does. And that emerging definition, without being explicit, is some sort of transfer of knowledge skills to another younger child, a younger human being, in such a way that I'm responsible for it and I can measure how she is doing. That's the set of assumptions in there. And if you look at the literature around how to train new teachers based on that frame and that metaphor, practically, because it is a metaphor after all is said and done. It's an attempt to say exchange, all right, receptor, somebody filling it, and so forth. I would argue that it's time to stop and go back, all right? Because we have better experiences and better literature, better metaphors, all right, around what this act really is. At least, all right, metaphors that correct or basically balance that cognitive exchange metaphor. And I would simply talk about 2. You know, one is the wonderful early book by Parker Palmer on kind of the act of teaching, in which he basically says, before you teach, if he understands what it is, it really is, in some senses, using subject matter, whatever the subject matter is, to engage one ego, one person, with a series of younger, but very sophisticated and very complex other persons, in some sort of opening, some sort of invitation into a subject matter in which the subject matter is important, but is only the ball in the game, all right? And the game is this exchange. And if you're not terribly clear about who you are as you start the game and are in charge of the game, you can't possibly have the ability to invite other persons in at a level that is authentic, ongoing, powerful, and ultimately for him, obviously, moral. All right? It's his insight and his metaphor, all right? And I probably don't do justice to it here, all right? But I've read it many times in my life. I think he's close to a deep, profound issue. It's the moral element of this practice and this profession, which is to say it is an exchange with other persons around some sort of choice to become a responsible learner, a responsible person with other persons. And you have to be one yourself in all sorts of self-aware ways in order to lead that journey. You must be. And if he's right, we really, instead of teaching subject matter in the schools of education, ought to be undergoing analysis. All right? Because he's right, you do, if you want to do it well. Everybody's personhood is on the line any given day for those 12 years in a deeply formative way, the moral issue. And if in some senses you aren't terribly skilled at protecting it, pushing it, supporting it, in some senses wrapping it in the right way, and orchestrating the relationships among them in that journey, you probably are not doing justice not to the subject matter, but to the work itself. The other metaphor that I've always, again, I've alluded in other talks to Seymour Saracen at Yale many years ago. He wrote a beautiful book on teaching as, in some sense, a performing art. And I have to say that the reason I read it, and then I went and found him in the world and became a good friend of his, was because of that book. That book talks about teaching as, if you will, an actor. And I always thought that that's what it felt like to me. I knew the subject matter. I had the fortune of working in a school where they wanted to get it because they were ready little learners. And so I basically, what I did every day, all right, was to go in and in some senses play the play, which was to invite them in, but to invite them in with as much excitement and as much fun and as much of a dance, all right. It was closer to music and to dance and to that kind of a performing art, and they would rise to it. I would get to play them against each other and watch them take it away from me. I would take it back. That's the dance that it always seemed to me kept us alive, and kept us alive not just, at 45, I guess, but to drove us deeper, more deeply into a moral profession in which we were able to grow as well. All right? Because the danger of this profession is that any given day the exchange is with somebody much younger and not in a power position. And to grow, one must have feedback, strong feedback, and one has to be open to it with other learning, ordinarily adults. All right? But if you are going to choose to live a life with younger children around that exchange, you have to be open, thoughtful, and ready to make that journey in the same fashion, to get feedback, to make that kind of interesting exchange that is all of our dance with each other when it's fun. All right? The point I wanted to stop and do that little riff is the danger of, in some senses, public policy and the language of politics as it grinds down to a thing called education is, although it is very often authentic, driven by deep concerns, and has some modicum of truth to it, it is so far off of the reality of the dance, the reality of the exchange, the reality of the profession, that what you get is in some senses a whale of disbelief and the danger is in its downside, kind of victimhood, but the whale of the profession saying, that's not what we do. All right? It's a piece of what I do, and I know I do subject matter, and I know we can measure and should measure them, but that's not at the core of who I am and what it is I do. And so you end up having this deep dialogue around all the machinery of how, so far off of the deeper understanding of the profession that you're bound to get it wrong. There has no chance of, in some senses, being a balanced, thoughtful way that describes the deeply qualitative journey. And so with Turn, we've been using another kind of a model to simply start the conversation. All right? So go back to Turn. Turn is in some senses a place where we can frame the deeper kinds of struggles that we're having with this thing called educational reform and retool and rethink kind of what it is we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. And here's the simple tool that we've been using. All right? We basically have tried to say, well, if you were basically doing this wonderful thing called public education, and we look at our history and our general literature of intent, we basically would say that we are trying to do at any one time 4 things, all right? And trying to do them all at once. I would do them differently with a 6-year-old than I would with a 17-year-old, but I am doing the same work. And that work, in some senses, has to do with, first of all, the piece that's obvious, which is this is cognitive growth around certain skills. all right? And it's different at the beginning struggles of literacy. It's different than teaching pre-calculus, all right? But it is the same journey, at least in terms of this. But meanwhile, there are 25 or 30 of them making this journey, whatever it is, with me, all right? And I, in some sort of wonderful kind of half angelic magician and half player of plays, I'm trying to engage them and take care of them and push them, urge them to move as human beings, take the next step. That is, in some senses, it's moral and it's social, all right, growth and development. It's the growth and development of a child, for goodness sakes, all right? It is, while most of the teachers, particularly elementary teachers, chose the profession in the first place. They didn't choose it for this, they chose it for this. And certainly, most of the teachers choose it for both of these issues. I've alluded to the fact that always in this society, we thought that in some deep sense, still believe it, all right? Want to believe that this thing called education is the thing that makes the road equal or has the possibility of making it less steep for children with certain kinds of economic and social kinds of journeys that are tougher than others. For some, extremely steep. And this is, in some senses, one of the salvation pieces. Now, we load this thing, because this is easy to load, all right, without taking a look at housing, taking a look at income, taking a look at jobs, taking a look at all those other things that in some senses go deeply in behind this. It's just easier to load this thing. You can get a hold of it, you can blame it, you can put too much pressure on it, and so forth. But that doesn't diminish its power and it being necessary part of this equation. And then the piece that in some senses is sad, because it's hard, and it's hard to put up here, which is sad in the sense that this thing always was some sort of mechanism for making us all kind of citizens and teaching us what that meant. That is to say, to sit in there together, if you will, for 12 years is quite a journey, all right? And you learn all sorts of things around how to live with different skills, how to live with different values, and in some senses, how to work it out with respect and so forth. And the teacher is always teaching, all right? How to learn how to forgive, how to ask for forgiveness, how to, in some senses, patch and move forward and so forth together. All right? And that happens actually about 5 times a day on kind of an easy day. All right? That you're teaching somehow how to be together with respect. And in behind there is a set of values, the social values, but in some deep sense, we used to call that civic religion. All right? And in many ways, this thing called public education was founded by Beecher and others who basically had it with kind of the religious approach to this and wanted something that carried, if you will, the social and broader civic kinds of virtues. The problem, and the reason I said it's sad, is as we've become polarized in the beginning of the 21st century, certainly in the, from Vietnam perhaps on, from the 60s on, there is a thing in here that I guess the language, and I'm hesitant to use it, but it's a left and a right. It's a different view of society and the role of the individual. Both groups, in some senses, are not quite sure that they trust, and I'm using it kind of a nice, gentle language. They do not trust us in public education to carry that set of values for their children. So they would just as soon that we did not get near it. And so over the years, the things we can talk about in social science and history and literature, and the things we in some senses can engage children in debate and thoughtful reflection early on around, gets narrower and narrower, it seems to me, all right? And this becomes, in some senses, a question mark at this stage in our society around whether we have enough of a common base of virtues and beliefs that we want this thing to carry it. It would be a lovely debate in the country to have, again. All right? We draw this thing and we think about it this way because here's what we think has happened. And I say that not because I have a solution out, but because I do know that we need a frame that allows us to talk about what it is we think we're trying to do here and why we're doing it. What's happened in our reform 10 years ago, most of it unintended consequences, is that we decided to measure and to test. But we couldn't do the whole thing, and so we started with what it is we could do. Millions of children. Well, the two major areas are literacy and numeracy, and so we divide it down the middle, and we put most of our focus here in terms of measurement. And then, as I've talked about in other places, we hooked that to evaluation in a somewhat punitive way towards the profession and the professional and so forth. And as we did that, all right, this thing overnight, became the definition of what it is we were about. All dialogue around all of this, in some senses, goes quiet almost overnight. We stopped teaching almost overnight. The fine arts, music, and so forth. We stopped teaching geography, for goodness sakes. We stopped teaching all literature, and so forth and so on. All right, we are going to end up with children who do not speak any other language. Let's hope they get their own in here. And in some senses, don't know who they are or where they are in the world. That's the danger of, in some senses, becoming world-class competitive. You got to get your mind around that, all right? But the point is that this became very narrow, very fast. And by that I simply mean, I'm not talking about the folks who write this stuff or try to translate it in some senses. I'm talking about the men and women who do the work of the dance in a classroom every day. And what they focused on 5, 6, 7 years ago, what they started working with each other on, and so forth. And it became so narrowly focused. And here I'm just talking about the curricular losses. All right? If you moved around this, and you get a faint voice in the country that says, what's the effect of measuring a first grader on some of this early on? What does that do? That's a very faint. But that's the kind of question that every teacher with 25 children is thinking about every day. All right? That's the exchange, all right, of the person and the underage, if you will, persons, the moral journey here. You must protect as you move here, because sometimes it is dangerous on a given day to risk, to be exposed. All right? And all of that in some senses goes quiet. This in some senses, fascinating, when this thing started, there were still at least 25 federal court cases using the school system as in some senses the fulcrum for this. They fell away overnight. Overnight. The lovely gift of No Child Left Behind, and I know that sounds strange, is the fact that at least it forced us to measure by different groups. And we are still living, all right, with anything between 20 and 40%, all right, achievement gap, all right. And I think very often the leadership here has said, don't talk to me about social justice, talk to me about, in some senses, these scores. They are hooked, I understand it, all right. But you have to keep a focus, a deep focus on what you're doing to make up that difference and to change that in order to make this real. And last but not least, I think in some senses this thing has gone even doubly mute in terms of what it is we think we're trying to do here. This thing was not, I think, seen as the great equalizer anymore. All of the literature around the fact that even when children of different color are in the same school, unless one has explicitly with the adults thought long and hard and worked with the leadership of the students around this, they eat separately, they talk separately, they live separately. That is not exactly what the dream was here. All right? And so, again, no answers here, but at least an attempt to say, we've got to stop and somehow ask a series of tough questions here. First one is, I mean it to have an edge, who was the protector of that circle when we started? And by that I simply mean somebody, when it froze so narrowly overnight, all right, some group of people, a profession that knew exactly who it was and what it does, would have stood up almost immediately and said, no, this is what we're doing. We'll come with you on this as long as we don't lose balance and so forth. I think we'd have to be really tough on ourselves and say, that voice did not come for the first 6 or 7 years. All right? There was no place. And that's a good, tough question for our organized labor groups, for our two groups that represent this profession. If you, in some senses, have defined yourself only as part of the profession, as a pay and benefit group, and not as a protector of the deep practice, then you wouldn't, in some senses, rise to that with such power that was required here. All right? The schools of education didn't rise and try to stop this. So you'd have to ask yourself, where would I hear those voices that would say to me, let's keep this whole, let's keep this entire, let's keep this practicing in a powerful way. So in some senses, we really want to create a venue again in which the voice of the practitioner comes together, and not simply, and we have wonderful school districts, for instance in California right now, in Caltern, who are simply opening again the qualitative issues here of how we would know when children were making movement here, and how to put those on the plate of evaluation, of measurement, at least to open up the how based on some discussion of the what. Because in some senses, if you don't go home, all right, and if you don't go home to, in some senses, your early and deep dream about what you were doing, and you start the debate out here about how to measure it, you lose early on, all right? In all of this machinery and all of this polarization, you simply lose the core. So we want to create a place where, you know, collaboratively, safely, with deep kind of listening to the voice of the professional, we get to ask that question again in all of its breadth and all of its depth.